In the early morning of June 23, 1941, barely 24 hours after the start of Operation Barbarossa, a coded message arrived at the headquarters of Army Group Center. It did not come from the enemy, but from their own forward commanders. It read, "We have encountered an unknown Soviet tank, impenetrable to our weapons, high mobility, great firepower." The German High Command initially believed these were exaggerations born from the chaos of the front, but when the first remains of Panzer III's and Panzer IV's began arriving in tow, pierced as if they were made of paper, the truth became impossible to deny. That day, for the first time, the German command saw the T-34, and in that instant they understood that the war they had planned was not the war they were facing. This documentary reveals how that encounter destroyed a central myth of German military thinking, that their technology, training, and doctrine were superior to anything the Soviet Union could produce. In June 1941, the Wehrmacht was considered the most powerful military force in the world, and it had reasons to believe it. In just 2 years, it had conquered Poland in 27 days, defeated France in 6 weeks, and subjugated Yugoslavia and Greece in less than a month. The doctrine of lightning war, the Blitzkrieg, had proven its effectiveness in every theater of operations. The core of this doctrine was the combination of speed, coordination, and concentrated firepower. German tanks were not necessarily the heaviest or most armored, but they were designed to act as cohesive units, supported by motorized infantry, mobile artillery, and tactical aviation. The Panzer III, armed with a 50mm cannon, was the workhorse of the armored divisions. The Panzer IV, with its short 75mm cannon, provided support against fortified positions. These vehicles had been sufficient to shatter French defenses, considered among the most solid in Europe. German tactical doctrine, heir to the theories of Heinz Guderian, emphasized breaking enemy lines through deep penetrations and rapid envelopments. In Poland, this doctrine had worked to perfection. In France, it had worked even better than expected. The German view of the Soviet enemy. But success generated something more dangerous than confidence. It generated certainty. A certainty built on biased intelligence reports and deeply rooted ideological prejudices. German intelligence reports prior to Barbarossa described the Red Army as a numerous but technically inferior force. Soviet tanks were considered obsolete, derived from British designs from the 20s. The Great Purge of 1937 had eliminated thousands of experienced officers, leaving the Red Army without competent leadership. The Winter War against Finland in 1939–1940 had exposed serious Soviet organizational and tactical deficiencies. The German High Command, the OKH, operated under the premise that the Soviet Union was a giant with feet of clay. Numerous, yes, but poorly trained, poorly equipped, and poorly led. Soviet industry was seen as primitive, incapable of producing armament of quality comparable to German weapons. Nazi ideology, moreover, reinforced this view. The Slavic population was considered racially inferior, incapable of mastering modern technology. This contempt was not exclusive to political leaders. Internal Wehrmacht documents show that even experienced officers shared this vision. Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, wrote in his diary that he expected a campaign of 8 to 10 weeks. Heinz Guderian, the most distinguished theorist on the use of armor, believed that Soviet resistance would collapse quickly once the initial defense lines were broken. The planning of Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa was designed as the definitive application of Blitzkrieg. 3 million German soldiers, organized into 3 army groups, would attack simultaneously on a front of more than 3,000 kilometers. Army Group North would advance toward Leningrad. Army Group Center would march toward Moscow. Army Group South would conquer Ukraine and its industrial resources. The German tanks were the spearhead of this plan. The Panzer divisions had to break Soviet defenses, advance 100 kilometers or more in a single day, and close pockets of encirclement around enemy formations. Everything depended on speed. Everything depended on maintaining the initiative. Everything depended on the enemy being exactly what the Germans expected. But the enemy was not. On June 22, 1941, at 3:15 in the morning, German artillery opened fire along the entire Soviet border. Thousands of Luftwaffe aircraft took off to destroy Soviet aviation on the ground. The Panzer divisions crossed the border and began their advance. The first reports confirmed German expectations. Soviet defenses, surprised and disorganized, collapsed rapidly. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured. Hundreds of BT and T-26 light tanks were destroyed without difficulty. The Panzer IIIs could pierce their armor from distances of over a kilometer. The German advance reached speeds of up to 80 kilometers daily in some sectors. But among the remains of destroyed Soviet units, some German commanders began to find something different. Unknown tanks, larger, with an unusual profile, and completely intact, abandoned by their crews in the chaotic retreat. The first documented encounter. On June 23rd, advance elements of the 6th Panzer Division, part of Army Group Center, reported contact with a Soviet tank of unknown type near Grodno in Belarus. The tank had been found immobile, apparently abandoned due to mechanical problems. German officers examined it with curiosity. It was larger than any Soviet light tank they had seen. Its armor had a pronounced slope. It mounted a 76mm cannon, significantly more powerful than the 45mm cannons of Soviet light tanks. But the most disturbing thing was its armor. Measured with field instruments, it exceeded 45mm of frontal thickness, with angles that increased its effectiveness. The report was sent to the OKH, but without giving it much importance. An isolated tank did not represent a strategic threat. Moreover, it had been abandoned, which confirmed Soviet disorganization. But that same day, further south, in the Army Group South sector, something occurred that could not be ignored. The Battle of Brody. Between June 23rd and June 30th, 1941, one of the largest tank battles in all military history took place. Near the city of Brody in western Ukraine, the German 1st Panzer Group faced 5 Soviet mechanized corps in a desperate attempt by the Red Army to halt the German advance. The Germans expected to find a disorganized mass of light tanks. What they found was different. Among the hundreds of Soviet tanks destroyed or captured, there were dozens of T-34s, and some of them had not been abandoned. They had fought, and they had caused casualties. German combat reports from those days show a disturbing pattern. The 50mm projectiles from the Panzer III bounced off the frontal armor of the T-34 at normal combat distances. The short 75mm cannon of the Panzer IV also failed to achieve consistent penetrations. The only effective projectiles were the 88mm rounds from the flak anti-aircraft guns, but these heavy weapons could not keep pace with the advance of the Panzer divisions. A report from the commander of the 11th Panzer Division describes how a single T-34 stopped the advance of a column for several hours, destroying 5 Panzer IIIs before being immobilized by a coordinated air attack. Another report mentions that T-34 projectiles pierced the frontal armor of German tanks from distances exceeding 1,500 meters. The initial bewilderment. The most disturbing thing for German commanders was not just that a superior tank existed, it was that no one had warned them of its existence. Intelligence reports prior to Barbarossa did not mention the T-34. It did not exist in identification manuals. There were no estimates of its number or distribution. Yet here it was, in significant quantities, operating in multiple sectors of the front. Messages sent from the front to the OKH oscillated between alarm and disbelief. Some officers suggested they were experimental prototypes. Others believed they were imported from the West, perhaps British or American manufacture. The idea that Soviet industry could produce a tank superior to German ones seemed impossible. But the destroyed, captured, and examined tanks told a different story, and that story was about to destroy the fundamental certainties upon which Operation Barbarossa had been built. The first intact T-34. At the end of June 1941, a T-34 in operational condition fell into German hands near Minsk. It had become immobilized in swampy terrain, and its crew abandoned it before it could be destroyed. For the first time, German engineers were able to conduct a complete technical examination. The tank was transported to a testing facility in Germany. What they found there changed the German understanding of what was technologically possible. Sloped armor, an invisible revolution. The most striking aspect of the T-34 was its sloped armor. The frontal glacis was inclined at 60 degrees from vertical. The turret sides had pronounced angles. Even the rear of the hull featured inclinations. This design was not aesthetic, it was functional. Sloped armor increased effective thickness without adding weight. A projectile that impacted a sloped surface had to traverse more material than if it impacted perpendicularly. Moreover, many projectiles simply bounced off when encountering an angled surface. German engineers measured the frontal armor of the T-34, 45 millimeters thick, but due to the inclination, the effective thickness exceeded 75 millimeters. This meant that the T-34 had frontal protection equivalent to that of German heavy tanks, but with much less weight. German tanks, by contrast, used vertical or nearly vertical armor. The Panzer III had 50 millimeters of frontal armor, but without inclination. The Panzer IV had 50 millimeters in its later versions, also vertical. In terms of effective protection, the T-34 far surpassed them. Diesel engine, power and safety. The T-34 was powered by a V2 diesel engine of 500 horsepower. German tanks used gasoline engines. This difference was not minor. Diesel was less flammable than gasoline. An impact that did not completely penetrate the armor could cause a fire in a gasoline tank. In a diesel tank, the probability was much lower. This meant greater survival for the crew and greater possibility that the tank could be repaired. Moreover, diesel had greater range. The T-34 could travel up to 400 kilometers on a full tank under ideal conditions. The Panzer III and IV reached between 150 and 200 kilometers. In the vast expanses of the Soviet Union, where supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers, this difference was critical. German engineers immediately recognized the superiority of the diesel engine, but they also understood that Germany could not change its production. German industry did not manufacture diesel engines for tanks in the necessary quantities. Redesigning the entire production chain would take years. The Christie suspension, superior mobility. The T-34 used a Christie suspension system with large independent wheels and internal coil springs. This design provided exceptional mobility on irregular terrain. German tanks used torsion bar suspensions or more complex leaf spring systems. They were effective on roads, but in mud, snow, or rough terrain, their performance decreased significantly. German tests with the captured T-34 showed that it could traverse terrains where Panzer IIIs became stuck. Its greater track width, combined with the Christie suspension, distributed weight more effectively. In the conditions of the Eastern Front, where paved roads were scarce and rains turned paths into rivers of mud, this advantage was decisive. A German technical report of July 1941 concluded, "The T-34 possesses all-terrain mobility superior to any tank currently in service in the Wehrmacht." The armament, the 76mm cannon. The T-34 mounted an F-34 76.2mm cannon. This cannon could fire armor-piercing, explosive, and fragmentation projectiles. Its penetration capability far exceeded that of the German 50mm cannons. Tests demonstrated that the 76mm cannon could pierce the frontal armor of a Panzer III at more than 1,500 meters. The Panzer IV was vulnerable at even greater distances. In direct combat, a T-34 could destroy German tanks from positions where they could not effectively respond. The unacceptable conclusion. The final technical report on the T-34, prepared in August 1941, reached a conclusion that contradicted everything the German High Command had believed until then. The T-34 tank is superior to any German tank currently in service in terms of armor, armament, mobility, and range. Its design represents a significant advance in tank technology. Soviet industry has demonstrated a technical capability that was completely underestimated. This report recommended the immediate development of a German tank with equivalent characteristics. It also warned that the T-34 could be in mass production, which represented a greater strategic threat than any other Soviet weapon. This conclusion was not well received. It contradicted the official narrative. It contradicted intelligence estimates. It contradicted the ideology that sustained the war. But it was irrefutable. The T-34 was there, in German testing facilities, demonstrating with each test that the Soviet Union had surpassed Germany in tank design. And the worst was yet to come. Because the T-34 was not an experimental prototype, it was a mass production weapon. During the summer of 1941, the German advance continued. Panzer divisions penetrated deeply into Soviet territory. Enormous pockets of encirclement were created. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured. In statistical terms, Barbarossa seemed a success. But beneath the surface, something had changed. Panzer division commanders began to report a worrying phenomenon. Their tanks needed artillery or aviation support to face T-34s. Tank versus tank combats, which had been decisive in France, now required more cautious tactics. Armored columns advanced more slowly when the presence of T-34s was reported in the area. This change of pace was subtle but significant. Blitzkrieg depended on speed. Every hour of delay allowed the enemy to reorganize. Every pause to coordinate support slowed the advance. And the T-34, even in relatively small numbers, was forcing the Germans to pause. Operational reports from August 1941 show a different language from that of June. They no longer speak of uninterrupted advances. They speak of unexpected resistance, energetic defense, difficulties in the advance. The T-34 is repeatedly mentioned as a complicating factor. Soviet production, the hidden truth. What the Germans still did not fully understand was the scale of Soviet T-34 production. In 1940, the Soviet Union had begun mass production in several factories. By June 1941, more than 1,000 T-34s had already been manufactured. This figure was unknown to the German High Command. Intelligence reports had estimated that the USSR possessed between 20,000 and 25,000 tanks, but they considered that most were obsolete models. The existence of a modern tank in mass production had not been contemplated. As the summer progressed, encounters with T-34s became more frequent. They were not isolated cases. They appeared in all sectors of the front. And most worryingly, many of them were crewed by inexperienced teams who abandoned them at the first mechanical problem. This suggested that there were many more T-34s available than the Germans had destroyed or captured. In September 1941, German analysts began to recalculate their estimates. If the T-34 had been in production since 1940, and if Soviet factories had not been completely destroyed by bombing, then the Soviet Union could be producing hundreds of these tanks each month. This realization was devastating. Germany produced approximately 250 tanks per month in 1941, including all models. If the USSR was producing T-34s at a comparable or higher rate, and if each T-34 was superior to German tanks, then the German numerical advantage would disappear in a matter of months. The Battle of Moscow, the T-34 in its element. In October 1941, the Wehrmacht launched Operation Typhoon, the final offensive against Moscow. It was the last attempt to destroy the Red Army before winter. The Panzer divisions, exhausted by months of continuous combat, had to break Soviet defenses and capture the capital. But the weather changed. Autumn rains turned unpaved roads into quagmires. German tanks, with their less effective suspensions and narrower tracks, became stuck constantly. The advance slowed to infantry pace. The T-34, with its greater track width and Christie suspension, maintained its mobility. Soviet counterattacks took advantage of the mud to strike German flanks. For the first time in the war, Soviet tanks had tactical advantage on the battlefield. When winter arrived, the situation worsened. Below-zero temperatures froze the gasoline engines of German tanks if they were not kept running constantly. The T-34's diesel engine was more resistant to extreme cold. The Germans discovered that their tanks needed special heaters and antifreeze that were not available in sufficient quantities. A report from Army Group Center in December 1941 stated, "Our tanks are immobile due to weather. Enemy tanks continue operating. I urgently request the dispatch of winter weather equipment." The response was that no equipment was available. Germany had not planned for a winter war. Recognition of reality. In November 1941, with the offensive on Moscow stalled and the first Soviet counteroffensives beginning, General Heinz Guderian wrote a memorandum to the High Command. In it, he declared, "The technical superiority of the T-34 tank over our vehicles is indisputable. I urgently request the development of a German tank with equivalent or superior characteristics. Without it, our Panzer divisions cannot maintain their operational effectiveness." This memorandum marked a turning point. Guderian, the father of German Panzer doctrine, the theorist of Blitzkrieg, the commander who had conquered France, was admitting that the enemy had a superior weapon. Other commanders sent similar reports. General Ewald von Kleist, commander of the 1st Panzer Group, wrote, "The T-34 is the best tank in the world." General Ludwig Cruel declared, "The encounter with the T-34 has been the most unpleasant experience of my entire military career." These were not minor complaints about technical deficiencies. They were admissions that a fundamental pillar of German military doctrine, technological superiority, had turned out to be an illusion. And in December 1941, when Soviet troops launched a massive counteroffensive that forced the Germans to retreat for the first time in the war, the T-34 was at the center of that offensive, not as an experimental weapon or a prototype, as the standard tank of the Red Army. The Wehrmacht had expected to face an obsolete army. It had found an army that in at least one critical aspect was superior. In November 1941, with the offensive on Moscow stalled and reports about the T-34 accumulating in Berlin, the German High Command convened an emergency meeting. Wehrmacht officers, engineers from major armament companies, and representatives from the Ministry of Armament participated. The conclusion was unanimous. Germany needed a new tank, immediately. Two options were evaluated. The first was to directly copy the T-34. German engineers had captured specimens. They could measure each component, replicate the design, and begin production in months. But this option was rejected. Copying the T-34 implied publicly admitting that the Soviet design was superior. Moreover, German industry would have difficulties replicating certain components. The Soviet V2 diesel engine was made of aluminum alloys that Germany could not produce in the necessary quantities due to raw material shortages. The wide tracks of the T-34 required manufacturing processes different from German ones. The second option was to design a new tank that incorporated the lessons of the T-34 but maintained German engineering. This option was chosen. In January 1942, specifications were issued for what would become the Panzer V Panther. It should have sloped armor like the T-34. It should mount a high-velocity 75mm cannon capable of piercing T-34 armor at long distance. It should have superior all-terrain mobility. Development began immediately. Companies like MAN, Daimler-Benz, and Henschel competed for the contract. Prototypes were evaluated in 1942. Mass production began in 1943. But there was a fundamental problem: time. The production gap. The Panther was an excellent tank. When it entered service in 1943, it was technically superior to the T-34 in many aspects, but by then, the Soviet Union had been producing T-34s en masse for 3 years. In 1941, the USSR produced approximately 3,000 T-34s. In 1942, it produced 12,500. In 1943, it produced 15,700. By 1945, total production exceeded 57,000 T-34s. Germany, by contrast, produced approximately 6,000 Panthers during the entire war. Moreover, the Panther was a complex tank with frequent mechanical problems in its early versions. Its transmission failed regularly. Its engine overheated. Its excessive weight made it vulnerable to getting stuck in soft terrain. The T-34, by contrast, was a simple design. It could be produced by inexperienced workers in factories without sophisticated equipment. Its components were interchangeable. Its maintenance was elementary. And Soviet industry, evacuated east of the Urals and beyond the reach of German bombing, produced these tanks in massive quantities. The gap was not just technological, it was industrial, and Germany had no way to close it. While the Panther was being developed, the Wehrmacht needed immediate solutions. The existing Panzer IIIs and IVs had to face the T-34 in 1942 and 1943. The response was to improve existing tanks. The Panzer IV received a long 75mm cannon in 1942, which could pierce T-34 armor at reasonable distances. Its frontal armor was increased through the installation of additional plates. These improvements turned the Panzer IV into a respectable opponent for the T-34. But these modifications had costs. The improved Panzer IV was heavier, slower, and more expensive to produce. Its mobility decreased, its fuel consumption increased, and it remained inferior to the T-34 in all terrain conditions. The Wehrmacht also developed specific tactics to face the T-34. German tanks should avoid frontal combat. They should use ambushes, take advantage of terrain elevation, and attack the flanks and rear of the T-34, where its armor was weaker. Anti-tank guns of 75 and 88 millimeters should be deployed in defensive positions to compensate for the inferiority of the Panzer IIIs. These tactics worked, but required discipline, coordination, and experience. When they worked, German crews, better trained, could destroy T-34s in significant numbers. But these tactics were reactive, not offensive. They transformed panzer divisions from rapid penetration forces into defensive forces. Blitzkrieg, the foundational doctrine of the Wehrmacht, depended on tactical and technological superiority. With the T-34 on the battlefield, that superiority had disappeared. The psychological cost. Beyond numbers and technical specifications, the T-34 had a profound psychological impact on the Wehrmacht. German soldiers who had been trained to believe in their technological superiority now faced a weapon that was objectively better than theirs. The diaries and memoirs of German soldiers from the Eastern Front contain constant references to the T-34. They describe it with a mixture of respect and fear. Some call it hell on tracks. Others mention the characteristic sound of its diesel engine as an alarm signal. For commanders, the T-34 represented something more disturbing, evidence that their fundamental assumptions about the war were incorrect. If Soviet industry could produce a superior tank, what other assumptions were wrong? German training? Soviet organizational inferiority? The Red Army's capacity for resistance? These questions had no comforting answers. The encounter with the T-34 destroyed a myth that had sustained German expansion since 1939, the absolute technological superiority of the Wehrmacht. This myth was not empty propaganda. It was based on real successes. Poland had fallen in weeks. France, considered the greatest military power in Europe, had been defeated in a month and a half. German tanks had demonstrated their effectiveness in every theater of operations. But the T-34 revealed that this superiority was contextual, not absolute. German tanks had been superior to Polish, French, and British tanks of 1939-1940, but they were not superior to the T-34. And the T-34 had existed since 1940, before Barbarossa. This meant that Operation Barbarossa had been planned on incorrect information. German planners had underestimated not only the quantity of Soviet tanks, but their quality. They had assumed that Soviet industry was primitive, when in reality it had produced the best tank in the world. This revelation had deeper consequences than simple data correction. It questioned the capacity of German intelligence. It questioned ideological assumptions about Slavic inferiority. It questioned the viability of the entire Eastern strategy. Industrial reality. The second myth destroyed by the T-34 was the superiority of German industry. Germany considered itself the most advanced industrial nation in Europe. Its engineering was synonymous with quality. Its factories produced sophisticated armament that reflected decades of technical experience. But the T-34 demonstrated that sophistication was not equivalent to effectiveness. The T-34 was a simple design, even crude in some aspects. Its interior was Spartan, its controls were basic, its production did not require highly skilled workers. And yet, it was superior to German tanks in the aspects that mattered: armor, armament, mobility, and range. German industry could not replicate this combination. German tanks were precision engineering, with components manufactured to strict tolerances. This made them effective under ideal conditions, but fragile on the battlefield. The T-34 was pragmatic engineering, designed to be produced quickly and repaired with basic tools. When German engineers examined the T-34, they found defects according to their standards: rough welds, irregular surface finishes, components with wide tolerances. But these defects did not affect its performance. In fact, they facilitated its mass production. The Soviet Union produced more than 57,000 T-34s during the war. Germany produced approximately 24,000 tanks of all models combined. The difference was not just gross industrial capacity, it was design philosophy. Germany designed tanks as works of engineering. The Soviet Union designed tanks as weapons of war. Documents after Barbarossa. German archives contain revealing documents about the High Command's reaction to the T-34. In a memorandum from December 1941, General Franz Halder wrote, "The appearance of the T-34 has fundamentally altered the tactical situation in the East. Our previous estimates about Soviet technical capability proved to be completely incorrect." In January 1942, a report from the Armament Department stated, "The development of the Panzer V must be our highest priority. Without a tank capable of facing the T-34 on equal terms, our offensive operations in the East cannot succeed." In May 1942, Armaments Minister Albert Speer wrote to Hitler, "Soviet production of the T-34 exceeds our current capabilities. Even with the Panther in production, we will not be able to achieve numerical parity. We must consider alternative strategies." These documents show a clear progression from initial surprise to technical recognition to acceptance of a disturbing strategic reality. The Wehrmacht could not win a war of attrition against an enemy with numerical and industrial superiority in tanks. The moment of understanding. It is difficult to identify an exact moment when the German High Command understood that the war was lost. Military defeat did not occur on a specific day. It was a gradual process of erosion of capabilities and options. But the T-34 marked a psychological turning point. It was the first irrefutable evidence that the fundamental assumptions of the war were incorrect. It was not a tactical defeat that could be attributed to errors of individual commanders. It was not a situation that could be resolved with better training or better coordination. It was a structural reality. The enemy had better equipment. The enemy could produce that equipment in greater quantities, and Germany had no way to overcome that advantage in the time frame relevant to the war. The German offensives of 1942 and 1943 would still achieve tactical successes. The Battle of Kharkov in 1943 showed that the Wehrmacht was still capable of brilliant operations, but these successes were temporary. Each battle consumed resources that could not be replaced. Each tank destroyed was one less tank. Each experienced crew lost could not be replaced with the same quality. The Soviet Union, by contrast, could absorb massive losses and continue producing. Each month, hundreds of new T-34s arrived at the front. Crews improved with experience. Tactics were refined. The final lesson. The T-34 did not win the war by itself. Soviet victory was the product of multiple factors: its resistance of its population, its vastness of territory, material support from the Allies, German strategic errors, and the numerical superiority of the Red Army. But the T-34 symbolized something deeper than a technological advantage. It symbolized the difference between war as the Germans conceived it and war as it really was. The Germans had planned Barbarossa as a campaign of weeks, a perfect application of Blitzkrieg doctrine. They had assumed technological, tactical, and organizational superiority. They had believed that quality could overcome quantity. The T-34 demonstrated that these assumptions were illusions. War was not a competition of engineering elegance, it was a competition of industrial survival. And in that competition, simplicity, producibility, and durability mattered more than technical sophistication. When the first T-34 was examined by German engineers in June 1941, one of them commented, "If the Russians can produce this, then we understand nothing about this war." It was a deeper observation than he himself could know, because understanding came too late. By the time Germany developed the Panzer, the Soviet Union had already produced tens of thousands of T-34s. By the time German tactics adapted, the Red Army had already learned to use the T-34 effectively. By the time the German High Command recognized the magnitude of the error, there was no way to correct it. The T-34 did not defeat the Wehrmacht, but it showed the Wehrmacht that it could be defeated. And in the context of a military organization that had built its identity on the belief in its own invincibility, that revelation was in itself a form of defeat.